Listen to me carefully. Most people think avoidants don't feel love, that they're cold, distant, unavailable. That's a lie. The truth is when an avoidant truly feels authentic love for you, it doesn't look loud. It doesn't look obvious. It doesn't look like the movies. It looks confusing. It looks inconsistent. And if you don't understand it, you'll walk away from the real thing thinking it was nothing. So today, you're about to discover the real signs, the ones nobody talks about, that prove an avoidant doesn't just like you, they're emotionally invested in a way that scares them. When an avoidant begins to feel something real for you, the very first shift happens in a place most people overlook: their identity. These are individuals who have spent years, sometimes a lifetime, building emotional walls so refined that even they forget they're there. Distance becomes safety, control becomes comfort, and vulnerability, that feels like risk. So when they start letting you see their real self, understand this clearly: it's not casual, it's not accidental, and it's definitely not easy for them. At the beginning, you won't see some dramatic confession or a sudden emotional breakthrough. That's not how this works. It starts subtly. A slight change in tone. A moment where they pause before answering, as if deciding whether to give you the surface-level response or something more real. And then, maybe just for a second, they choose honesty. They might share a story they don't usually tell. Something about their past, something that shaped them, something that explains why they are the way they are.
And to you it might feel small.
But to them, that's a risk. You have to understand, avoidants don't hide because they don't feel. They hide because they feel deeply and don't trust that it's safe to express it. Somewhere along their journey, they learned that opening up led to pain, rejection, or loss of control.
So they adapted.
They became self-reliant, emotionally guarded, incredibly selective about who gets access to their inner world. Most people never get past the surface. Most people only see the composed version, the independent version, the version that doesn't need anyone. But when they start letting you in, even in fragments, it means something is shifting internally. It means they're beginning to associate you with safety instead of threat. And that's not a small thing, it's everything. Because for them, trust is not given freely. It's earned slowly, tested quietly, and protected fiercely. You might notice contradictions. One moment they're open, the next they're distant again. Don't misread that. That's not them playing games, that's them navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. They're stepping outside of a pattern that has protected them for years. So of course there's hesitation. Of course there's a pullback. But what matters is not perfection, it's progress. It's the fact that despite the discomfort, despite the instinct to shut down, they still come back to that space with you where they were real. And here's where most people get it wrong. They expect consistency too early. They think if they really care, they should just open up fully. But that expectation can actually push an avoidant further away. Because to them, being rushed feels like losing control again. And losing control is exactly what they've spent years trying to avoid. So instead of looking for grand gestures, look for the quiet ones. Look for the moments when they drop their guard just a little, when they admit something imperfect, when they show uncertainty instead of confidence, when they allow you to see not just who they are on the outside, but who they've been protecting on the inside. That's the real self. And here's the truth most people don't realize: when an avoidant shows you that version of themselves, they are not just sharing information. They are handing you responsibility. Because now you're holding something fragile, something they don't show the world. And how you respond in those moments determines everything. If you judge it, they retreat. If you dismiss it, they shut down. If you take it lightly, they rebuild the wall even stronger. But if you meet it with understanding, with patience, with emotional steadiness, something powerful happens. They begin to trust not just you, but the experience of being seen.
And that changes the entire dynamic.
Because now, it's no longer just about attraction or connection. It becomes something deeper. It becomes a space where they can slowly exist without the mask. And for someone who has lived behind emotional protection for so long, that kind of space is rare. So if you're wondering whether an avoidant feels authentic love for you, don't just listen to what they say.
Watch what they reveal. Watch what they risk.
Watch those small, unguarded moments where they let you see the parts they usually keep hidden.
That's not coincidence. That's not convenience.
That's trust being built in real time. And for an avoidant, that is one of the clearest signs that what they feel for you is real. When an avoidant pulls away, it triggers something deep in most people: confusion, anxiety, even the fear that something has gone wrong. You start questioning everything. Did I say too much? Did I push them away? Are they losing interest? And on the surface, it does look like rejection. The distance, the silence, the sudden shift in energy, it feels personal. But here's the truth that most people never understand. For an avoidant, pulling away is not always about you. It's about what's happening inside them. When emotions start getting real, when the connection moves beyond casual and begins to touch something deeper, avoidant doesn't feel excitement first. They feel pressure. Not because they don't care, but because they do. That growing emotional intensity starts to challenge their sense of control, and control is their safety zone. The more they feel, the more exposed
They become.
and exposure to them feels dangerous. So what do? They retreat, not as a strategy to manipulate you,
Not as a game.
but as a form of emotional regulation. It's their way of stepping back, creating space, and trying to process feelings they're not fully comfortable with yet. It's like their system gets overloaded, and distance becomes the reset button. Now here's where it becomes meaningful, because anyone can pull away, anyone can disappear, but not everyone comes back. If an avoidant keeps finding their way back to you, that's not random.
That's not accidental.
That's emotional gravity. It means that even though part of them is wired to create distance, another part of them is drawn toward you in a way they can't ignore. Think about that for a second. You are dealing with someone whose instinct is to detach when things get intense. Yet despite that instinct, despite that internal resistance, they still return. They reinitiate contact. They reconnect. They re-engage. That contradiction tells you everything you need to know, because if they truly didn't care, they wouldn't come back at all. Avoidants don't force connections they don't value. They simply move on and shut the door quietly. But when there is something real, something meaningful, something emotionally significant, then they can't fully detach, no matter how much space they try to create. Now, this doesn't mean the experience is easy. It's not. It can feel like a cycle: close, then distant, then close again. And if you don't understand what's happening, it can drain you emotionally. You might start chasing, over-explaining, or trying to fix the distance. But that usually backfires, because pressure only reinforces their need to pull away again. What actually matters is how you interpret the pattern. Instead of seeing the space as rejection, see it as part of their process. Not an excuse for unhealthy behavior, but an insight into how they handle emotional intensity. The key difference is this: are they disconnecting permanently, or are they regulating temporarily? Because those are two very different things. When an avoidant comes back, they're not just continuing the connection, they're choosing it again. And that choice matters because it's happening against their natural defense mechanisms. It means the connection with you is strong enough to override their instinct to stay distant. And over time, something interesting starts to happen. If the connection remains safe, steady, and non-threatening, those periods of distance can begin to shrink. The pullbacks become less extreme. The returns become more consistent. Why? Because their nervous system is slowly learning that closeness doesn't automatically lead to pain. But that process takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And it requires something most people struggle with: emotional patience. You have to resist the urge to react impulsively to every moment of distance. Not by ignoring your own needs, but by understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because if you misinterpret every pullback as rejection, you'll respond in a way that confirms their fear that closeness leads to pressure, conflict, or emotional overwhelm. And that's the fastest way to push them further away. So instead, watch the full pattern. Not just the moments when they step back, but the moments when they return. Watch how they reconnect. Watch if they invest again. Watch if they continue building, even if it's in their own imperfect way. Because real connection isn't about never creating distance, it's about whether the bond survives that distance. And when an avoidant pulls away, but keeps coming back to you, that's not indifference. That's internal conflict. That's an emotional struggle. And more often than not, that's a sign that what they feel is real, even if they don't fully know how to handle it yet. When an avoidant begins to include you in their world, it doesn't happen with big announcements or dramatic shifts. There's no sudden moment where they declare, "You're part of my life now." Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, through small changes that are easy to miss if you're only looking for obvious signs. But make no mistake, this is one of the clearest indicators that something real is developing beneath the surface. Avoidants are deeply protective of their personal space, their routines, and their independence. Their world is carefully structured to give them a sense of control. They know how they spend their time, how they manage their emotions, and how they keep things from getting too overwhelming. Letting someone into that space isn't just about companionship, it's about disrupting a system that has kept them safe for a long time. So when they start including you, what they're really doing is making room for you inside that system. At first, it might look simple. They start telling you about their day in more detail, not just surface level updates, but the little things, the frustrations, the decisions, the random thoughts that cross their mind. Then maybe they begin to ask for your opinion. That's a subtle but powerful shift because avoidants are used to relying on themselves. When they start valuing your input, it means your presence is beginning to matter in their internal world. Then it goes a little deeper. They begin to share parts of their routine with you. Maybe they call you during a time they usually keep to themselves. Maybe they invite you into an activity they normally do alone. It might not seem like a big deal from the outside, but for them, it's significant. They are taking something that used to be exclusively theirs and allowing you to be a part of it. And here's the key: it's intentional. Avoidants don't accidentally let people in. They don't casually merge lives the way some others might. Every step they take toward inclusion is measured, often unconscious, but still deliberate. They're testing how it feels to have you there. They're observing whether your presence brings comfort or pressure, ease or complication. You might also notice that they start introducing you in small ways to other parts of their life. Maybe they mention you to a close friend. Maybe they tell you about people who matter to them. Or they start sharing future plans that include you, even if it's something simple like, "We should go there sometime," or "You'd like this place." These aren't just casual comments, they're glimpses into a future where you exist alongside them. For an avoidant, that's a big shift. Because including someone in their world means acknowledging that the connection is not temporary. It means accepting, at least on some level, that this person could have a lasting presence in their life. And that idea alone can feel both exciting and terrifying. That's why the process isn't always smooth. There may be moments where they pull back slightly after letting you in a little more. Not because they regret it, but because it's new territory. They're adjusting to the feeling of closeness while trying to maintain their sense of independence. It's a balancing act, and sometimes they don't get it right. But what matters is the direction, not the perfection. If they continue to open that door, even inch by inch, it means they're choosing connection over isolation. It means they're allowing their world to expand to include someone else, and that doesn't happen unless the person truly matters to them. Another important thing to understand is that avoidants often express care through consistency rather than intensity. So instead of grand romantic gestures, you'll see steady, reliable inclusion. They show up. They make time. They integrate you into their life in ways that feel natural to them. It may not be flashy, but it's meaningful. And here's where most people misinterpret this stage. They expect speed. They want clear labels, fast progression, and visible commitment. But pushing for that too early can actually disrupt the process. Because for an avoidant, being rushed feels like losing control, and losing control triggers the very defenses that create distance. So instead, the real power lies in recognizing what's already happening. If they're making space for you, if they're inviting you into their routines, if they're considering you in their decisions, then you're already becoming part of their world. And that's not something they do lightly. Because for someone who has built their life around emotional independence, letting another person in isn't just a step forward, it's a transformation. It means they're no longer just protecting themselves from connection, they're beginning to participate in it. So don't just look for loud declarations. Look for quiet integration. Look for the subtle ways they make room for you. Because when an avoidant starts including you in their world, what they're really saying without words is that you're no longer on the outside. You're becoming part of something they once thought they had to face alone. When you're dealing with an avoidant, one of the biggest mistakes you can make is expecting love to show up in the form you're used to. Most people are conditioned to look for verbal reassurance, clear expressions, emotional conversations, and consistent affirmations like "I miss you" or "I love you." And when those words aren't there, it's easy to assume the feeling isn't there either. But with an avoidant, love doesn't start with words.
It starts with behavior.
These are people who often struggle to articulate emotions not because they don't feel them, but because putting feelings into words makes those feelings real, visible, and vulnerable. And vulnerability is exactly what they've trained themselves to avoid. So instead of speaking what they feel, they do what they feel. The problem is, if you're only listening for words, you'll miss everything they're trying to show you.
An avoidant might not send long,
emotional messages, but they'll check in on you in practical ways. They might not say "I care about you" deeply, but they'll make sure you got home safe. They may not open up about their feelings easily, but they'll show up when you need help, even if it inconveniences them. These are not random actions. These are intentional expressions of care, just in a language that's quieter and less obvious. And here's what makes it powerful. Actions require effort, presence, and consistency. Words can be said in a moment. Actions require a decision. When an avoidant consistently chooses to be there for you, to support you, to invest time and energy into your life, they are communicating something real, something grounded. It may not feel as emotionally expressive as you'd like, but it's often more reliable than empty promises. You might notice that they remember small details about you, things you mentioned casually, things you didn't even think were important. Then later, they act on it. They bring it up, they adjust their behavior, they do something thoughtful based on that information.
That's not accidental.
That's attention. That's care being translated into action. Another thing you'll see is that they show up during moments that matter. Not necessarily with grand gestures or dramatic displays, but with presence. Quiet, steady presence. When you're going through something difficult, they might not know exactly what to say, but they'll stay. They'll sit with you, help you, support you in ways that feel practical rather than emotional. And while it may not look like the kind of comfort you expected, it's their way of being there without stepping into emotional territory that feels overwhelming for them. And this is where many people misinterpret avoidance. They assume that because the emotional expression isn't verbal or intense, it must not be deep.
But depth isn't always loud.
Sometimes it's consistent. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's shown through the things a person doesn't have to do, but chooses to do anyway. Now, this doesn't mean you should ignore your own needs for communication. That's important. But it does mean you have to expand your understanding of what love can look like. Because if you're only measuring it by words, you're using the wrong scale for someone who expresses through action. There's also another layer to this fear of saying the wrong thing. Avoidants often overthink emotional conversations. They worry about being misunderstood, about saying too much, or not enough, or opening a door they don't know how to close. So instead of risking that discomfort, they default to what feels safer, doing rather than saying. But over time, if the connection feels safe and steady, those actions can slowly create space for words. Not forced, not rushed, but natural. Because once they see that their actions are received without pressure, without judgment, they will be more likely to take action. They begin to feel less threatened by the idea of expressing themselves more openly. Until then, their behavior is their language. So watch what they do when they don't have to do anything at all. Watch where they choose to invest their time, their energy, their attention. Because people always prioritize what matters to them, even if they don't talk about it. If they consistently show up, if they support you in practical ways, if they pay attention and act on what they learn about you, then you're not dealing with indifference. You're dealing with someone who cares, but expresses it differently. And once you understand that, everything starts to make more sense. You stop chasing words and start recognizing effort. You stop questioning the absence of verbal reassurance and start noticing the presence of consistent action. Because for an avoidant, saying "I love you" might feel overwhelming, but showing you again and again in quiet, steady ways, that's how they mean it. When an avoidant starts to feel something real, one of the clearest signs isn't comfort dash it's discomfort. And that's where most people get confused. They assume love should feel easy, natural, flowing. And while that may be true for some, for an avoidant, love doesn't begin with ease. It begins with internal conflict. Because love, real love, challenges everything they've built to protect themselves. Avoidants are wired to maintain emotional distance. It's how they've learned to stay safe, to stay in control, to avoid the kind of vulnerability that once felt overwhelming or painful. Their independence isn't just a preference, it's a defense mechanism. It gives them stability. It keeps things predictable. It allows them to exist without relying too deeply on anyone else. So when someone comes into their life and starts to matter in a deeper way, it disrupts that system. Suddenly they're thinking about someone more than they're used to. They're feeling emotions they can't easily compartmentalize. They're becoming aware of the possibility of loss, of dependency, of needing someone, and that awareness alone can create anxiety. Not because the connection is wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar to an avoidant often feels unsafe, so you'll start to see signs of discomfort. Maybe they become quieter at times. Maybe they hesitate before getting too close emotionally. Maybe they overthink situations that seem simple to you. They might even question the relationship, not because they want to leave, but because they're trying to make sense of what they're feeling. This is where it gets important, because discomfort can lead in two directions. It can lead someone to run, or it can lead someone to grow. If an avoidant is uncomfortable and chooses to completely disconnect, shut down and walk away without looking back, that tells you they're not ready to face what they're feeling. But if they're uncomfortable and they stay even imperfectly, even inconsistently, that's a completely different story.
That's effort. That's someone standing in a
Space that challenges them, that stretches them, that forces them to confront parts of themselves they've avoided for years, and choosing not to escape. And that choice matters more than any perfect behavior ever could. You might notice that they try in ways that don't always look smooth. They might struggle to communicate clearly. They might need time to process things that you would handle quickly. They might pull back slightly when things feel too intense, but they don't disappear completely. They stay connected, even if it's at a pace that feels slower than what you're used to. That's not indifference. That's someone learning how to exist in a kind of connection that doesn't come naturally to them. And growth, real growth, rarely looks polished. It looks like hesitation. It looks like small steps forward. It looks like trying even when it feels uncomfortable. For an avoidant, staying in a connection where emotions are real means facing fears they don't usually talk about. Fear of losing themselves. Fear of being overwhelmed. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being hurt. These aren't surface-level concerns, they're deeply rooted patterns that have shaped how they relate to others. So when they stay, they're not just staying with you. They're staying in the face of those fears. And that's where the meaning lies. Because anyone can stay when things are easy. Anyone can stay when there's no internal resistance. But when someone stays while feeling uncertain, while feeling stretched, while feeling challenged, that's a different kind of commitment. It's not loud, it's not always visible, but it's real. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore unhealthy behavior or accept inconsistency without boundaries. That's not the message. The message is to recognize the difference between someone who is avoiding you and someone who is struggling with their own emotional patterns while still choosing to remain connected. One is disengagement. The other is effort. And when you understand that difference, you stop taking every moment of discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. Instead, you begin to see it as part of a process where someone is slowly expanding their capacity to connect, to feel, and to stay present in something that matters. Because for an avoidant, love isn't just about feeling something positive. It's about learning how to handle everything that comes with it. The vulnerability, the uncertainty, the lack of control. So if you see someone who is clearly uncomfortable at times, who doesn't always have the perfect response, who may need space but still returns, still engages, still tries to maintain the connection, don't overlook that. Because what you're witnessing isn't confusion. It isn't lack of interest. It's courage. It's someone stepping outside of their emotional comfort zone and choosing not to run. And for an avoidant, that might be one of the strongest signs that what they feel for you is something real. At the beginning of any connection, an avoidance instinct is simple. If something feels too intense, too emotional, or too complicated, they step back. Not to hurt you, not to create drama, but to protect their sense of control. Conflict, especially emotional conflict, feels overwhelming to them. It threatens the balance they rely on. So their default pattern is to minimize, withdraw, or avoid engaging altogether. That's why this shift is so important. When an avoidant starts fighting for the connection instead of escaping it, you are no longer dealing with surface-level interest. You are seeing a fundamental change in behavior, one that goes directly against their natural wiring. Because choosing to engage in conflict, to stay present in difficult moments, to try to work through issues instead of shutting down, that requires emotional investment. It requires them to care enough about the connection that losing it feels worse than the discomfort of facing it. And that's not something they do lightly. At first, it may not look impressive. In fact, it might look awkward, even frustrating. They may not express themselves clearly. They might struggle to find the right words. They might pause, hesitate, or take longer than you'd like to respond. But the key thing to notice is this: they're not disappearing. They're staying in the conversation. They're attempting in their own way to understand what's happening, to process what they feel, and to find a way forward instead of walking away. And for someone who is used to avoiding emotional intensity, that's a big step. You might see them ask questions they wouldn't normally ask. You might notice them trying to explain themselves, even if it comes out imperfectly. You might feel that they're making an effort to meet you somewhere in the middle, even if they don't fully know how yet. That effort is the signal. Because when an avoidant doesn't value a connection, they don't argue, they don't explain, and they definitely don't try to fix things. They simply detach. Quietly. Completely. Without resistance. So if they are engaging, if they are trying to resolve tension instead of escaping it, it means the connection holds weight for them. It means you matter. Another important detail is how they handle recurring issues. In the early stages, they might avoid difficult conversations altogether. But as their feelings deepen, something begins to change. They start recognizing that avoiding problems doesn't protect the connection, it weakens it. And even though addressing those problems feels uncomfortable, they begin to see the necessity of it. So they try. They might not get it right every time. They might still need space to process. They might occasionally revert to old patterns when things feel too intense. But the difference is, they come back to the issue. They don't just leave it unresolved. They don't pretend it didn't happen. They show a willingness, however imperfect, to face it again. That willingness is growth. And growth, especially in someone with avoidant tendencies, is never instant. It's gradual. It's uneven. It comes with setbacks. But it's real when the direction keeps moving forward. You'll also notice that when they start fighting for the connection, their focus shifts. It's no longer just about protecting themselves, it becomes about protecting what you have together. They begin to consider not just how they feel, but how their actions affect you. That awareness alone is a powerful shift, because it means they're no longer operating purely from self-preservation. They're beginning to operate from connection. And connection requires responsibility. It requires showing up, even when it's hard. It requires staying engaged, even when emotions are messy. It requires choosing the relationship, not just when it feels good, but when it's being tested. So when an avoidant does that, when they stay in the difficult moments, when they try to communicate, when they attempt to resolve rather than retreat, you are seeing something deeper than attraction. You are seeing commitment in its early form. Not the kind that's declared with big words or promises, but the kind that's demonstrated through behavior under pressure. Because anyone can be present when everything is smooth. But the real test of connection is what happens when things aren't. Do they leave, or do they stay and try? If they're choosing to stay and try, even in a way that's not perfect, even in a way that still feels uncomfortable for them, that tells you something important. They're not just interested in you. They're invested in us. And for an avoidant, that shift from protecting themselves to protecting the connection is one of the strongest indicators that what they feel isn't temporary. It's something they're willing to work for. Something they're willing to face discomfort for. Something they're no longer trying to escape. And that's when you know the connection has moved beyond something casual into something that truly matters.